Morning, welcome everybody. My name is Nigel Boyle. I'm Director of the Institute for Global Local Action and Study here at Pitzer College. I'm also on the steering committee for the Mellon Latin America grant, which is sponsoring certain events over the next 3 years, including the two mega events occurring in Brazil. And it's by virtue of that grant that we have today's speaker. I think each World Cup sets new records in terms of the metrics used to measure global mega events. And these quadrennial cycles of the World Cup affect the Claremont curriculum here and also the Academy more broadly. Andre Wakefield and I 4 years ago taught the largest class in the history of the Claremont colleges, where during especially boring lectures the students could actually do the Mexican wave to sort of entertain themselves. And we've wisely gone for quality, not quantity, this time. But also now there are these academic conferences which occur immediately prior to World Cups. These used to be very small events, but the reason we have Simon Kuper in the US this week is that he, along with David Goldblatt and myself and others, are heading to the biggest soccer conference ever, taking place to Hofstra University in New York City. And by the way, the three keynote speakers at this conference are our own David Goldblatt, a guy called Pele, and Jennifer Doyle. And you'll be glad to hear that I didn't commit $100,000 from the Mellon funds to bring Pele here to give his "Don't worry, be happy" speech. But we are going to get Jennifer Doyle here at the end of next week. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad. You'll see Jennifer Doyle here shortly. But Simon is on his way to New York. When talking about Simon Kuper's work as a columnist for the Financial Times and the books he's produced, I have to resist the temptation to start sounding like the Ray Hudson, the beIN Sports announcer, where all Messi's goals are magisterial. All Simon's books are magisterial. And his columns as well. But what's especially impressive about what Simon has contributed to the emerging field of soccer studies is just the variety of things that he's done. So he's written with Stefan Szymanski this terrific book, Soccernomics, which microeconomists and sports economists across the US have used in courses. It has great appeal to those interested in the microeconomics and the economics of globalization. But he's also written these phenomenal books, in particular on Holland, on Dutch soccer and Dutch-German history, the history of Ajax and so forth, which are terrific cultural studies. And perhaps this is due in part to the fact that he's the child of two very famous anthropologists. But he brings a real sort of anthropological take on cultural transformation that's taken place with soccer as this particular lens. So I'm really delighted that we've been able to get Simon Kuper to come and speak to us here at Pitzer, and so please welcome Simon Kuper.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks, everyone, for coming so early in the morning. I want to talk about how the World Cup has changed over the last 25 years or so, from what used to be a festival of nationalism, a kind of head-to-head of nation against nation, to something much more globalized and cosmopolitan. And I think that mirrors a general decline of nationalism that we've seen in the socio-political sphere in most parts of the world. And so this is a talk about soccer as a mirror of things happening in the real world, the shift to cosmopolitanism. And I'm basing this partly on books I've read, but also on my experience of having been to every World Cup since 1990. So I witnessed that change personally. And my first one, I was 20 years old, and a friend came up to me in college in England and said, if you had tickets to the World Cup, would you go? And I said, yeah, of course. And I said, but why are we having this conversation anyway? And he said, well, I can get as many tickets to the World Cup as we want. Because dad of a friend of his worked for Mars. And Mars had all these corporate tickets in 1990, and they couldn't give them away because their American customers were not interested in going to the World Cup. And their European customers didn't want to be killed by British hooligans, which was the story going around in 1990. So we just got some Mars tickets, 3 of us, and we went over to Italy, and we had a brilliant time for a week. And the stadiums we were in were never full, at best half full. And I've seen the World Cup sort of grow from this village fete, as it was in Italia 90, to this enormous spectacle that David has been chronicling for you that is going to be in Brazil this summer. Now, to talk about nationalism, we first, of course, need to define it. And to me, it's the idea that people who share a language and share a culture, whatever a culture is, should live in a state ruled by people of that culture. So because people are French and they speak French and they have French culture, they should live in a French state. That's the idea of nationalism as I'm using it. Now, you might say that's a totally logical and banal idea, but in fact, it's pretty new. It's about 200 years old. And I'll quote the famous opening words of Elie Kadori's book, Nationalism. And he says, nationalism is a doctrine invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. And from Europe, it spreads around the world. And why does nationalism become very successful? Why does it appeal? And it's probably to do, excuse me, with the Industrial Revolution. And Ernest Gellner, who's one of the great theorists of nationalism, says when people live on the farm, which most humans did for most of history, they don't really need the idea of a nation because everyone you know lives more or less within walking or riding distance, and they speak the local dialect. And the nation, even if France has been a nation state for about 500 years, it just didn't mean much to most French people even, and most people in the world, like in this part of the world at that time, did not live in a nation. And it just wasn't a very useful concept. But then you get the new technology, you get the Industrial Revolution, and people move from their village to a city like Manchester or Munich. And they start to work in the factory, and they meet people from other villages who don't speak the same dialect. And often they need to start to learn to read, because once you're working in a factory, maybe you just need to read a little bit of the instruction manual for the machine. Jobs become more mechanized, more complex. So language, you need the national language, you need to be able to read it. And then you get the means of technology expanding. So you get the train. I think in Britain we got trains from the 1830s. So suddenly you can go much further than a horse can ride. And you get the radio. So you can listen to people far away in London or in Paris, cities you've never been. So you need the shared national language. You get highways, you get television. And so all this helps to create the nation. I mean, just 100 years ago when the French were mobilizing for World War I, and they conscripted all these peasant men, they realized to their horror, the people who ran France, that most French people couldn't speak French. They spoke some kind of local dialect. So if you were an officer from Paris and you were telling a Gascon regiment what to do, they couldn't understand you. And the Gascon couldn't speak to the Breton, etc. So all this is really rather recent, these national languages. And another key thing in making a nation important, I mean, as I say, you have the language, you have the bureaucracy which uses that language, and then you have the army. And we in Europe, we needed national armies because until 1945, everyone is fighting each other all the time. And so you have this national institution of the army, and then you need to teach people at school to love their country. That's the ideology of the nation. So they read school books saying ours is the greatest country in the world. In the case of Britain, we have this, we go around the world civilizing people who are not lucky enough to be British and teaching them our games. So each country writes school books with some version of the national story. And so you get nationalism. In the age of nationalism, and during this age, international sport starts. So de Coubertin in 1896, he has the first modern Olympics. And then in 1930, you get the first World Cup in Uruguay. So these nations start to play sports against each other. And of course, their leaders quickly figure out this is great for national prestige. If our country wins, it proves that our race is the superior race, our nation is best. So Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, is the first to run with this in a big way. And he's lucky. Italy have a very good football team. They're also lucky to have one World Cup in Italy, so he influences referees. They win 2 World Cups in the 30s. All proof that Italy is the greatest nation in history. Berlin Olympics, 1936. Hitler and other leading Nazis came from a generation where soccer hadn't yet become a big deal, so they didn't really know much about soccer. And Hitler had never seen a soccer match going into those Berlin Olympics. But the Gauleiter of Danzig, Albert Förster, who did like soccer, managed to persuade Hitler to come and watch Germany-Norway instead of going to the rowing, which Hitler was much more keen on. And so they sit there and watch Germany-Norway, and the Nazi propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, who's also there, he writes in his diary, "The Führer is very excited. I can barely contain myself. A real bath of nerves. The crowd rages, a battle like never before. The game is mass suggestion." But to the embarrassment of Förster, who'd invited Hitler to the game, Germany lost 2-0. And as far as we know, Hitler never saw another football match again. Now, from 39 to 45, you get a different type of nationalism taking over, armed nationalism. And then something very strange happens. War dies out, first in Europe, and then slowly across most of the rest of the planet. That's a long movement of these last 68, 69 years, the long peace. And the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, in this absolutely wonderful book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which changed my life, he points out that the number of wars between states in Western Europe since 1945 is 0. And he says this is really quite strange. Keep in mind, he writes, that up until that point, European states had started around 2 new armed conflicts a year since 1400. So, okay, we lose war as a means of expressing our nationalism after 1945. And instead we get soccer. So the period from about 1950 to 1990, which I'm going to talk about now, is really, you guys don't figure. The Asians don't figure, the Africans barely figure. The World Cup isn't a World Cup at all. It's a European, Latin American duopoly. We're almost the only countries who get to play. And so all the nationalism you see in World Cups in this period is Euro and Latin American. In the 1990 World Cup, my first one, there were 3 teams from the British Isles, England, Scotland, and Ireland. From all of Asia, there were 2 teams. So it shows that this was a totally unbalanced event. Now, in this period from the 50s, you get this first great outbreak of World Cup nationalism in Germany in 1954, when they play the World Cup final in the mud of Bern in Switzerland, just across the border, against Hungary. And Hungary are unbeatable. They're the best team in the world, and they're definitely going to win the final. I think they'd beaten Germany 8-3 earlier in the tournament. And this is the final. Germany in white. And people at home in Germany are crowding around the only TV set in their neighborhood. 100 people watching the game on a small TV set. The Regenschlacht, the rain battle, the military rhetoric is totally normal in football then. Herberger had been the Reichstrainer in the Third Reich. He'd coached the team of Nazi Germany before coaching the team of the Federal Republic. And this game, I mean, there's a famous film about it, The Miracle of Bern. There's also another great film by Fassbinder, Verlorene Ehe, the Ehe von Maria Braun, where the climactic scene is she commits suicide, I think. She gasses herself, and of course a very symbolic German act, to the radio commentator in the 1954 final, Herbert Zimmermann. And it's one of these legendary passages in sort of German radio that everyone of that generation knew. Tor, das Spiel ist aus, Deutschland Weltmeister. And Zimmermann goes into this kind of nationalist paean that moves these Germans who had been unable to express their nationalism after 1945. The old Nazi rhetoric had become taboo, and there was no new way to say how to be a German. There's a wonderful story by a man called Friedrich Delius, who writes about, as a child in 1954, he had never seen his father smile. And that day in 1954 was the first time he had seen his father happy. So it was a tremendously significant event, a new way to be a West German. And the train comes back from Bern, and it stops at every station, is mobbed by huge crowds. And then they get to West Berlin to celebrate the trophy. And in East Berlin, in the Soviet bloc, Germans are on the street celebrating too. And the crowd gathers at the town hall in West Berlin. And I think it's Theodor Heuss was by that time, I think, the president of West Germany, maybe he was mayor of Berlin. And anyway, he's very anxious because they're going to play the national anthem, which is still the same tune as Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. It's still that tune today. But the taboo words, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, are not sung anymore. They haven't been sung by Germans since 1945 because they're associated with Hitler, although they predated Hitler. So Heuss knows that the crowd is, when the tune breaks out, the crowd is going to sing Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Sorry, I'm not going to give you a rendering of my singing. And the tune breaks out, and the crowd indeed, everyone sings Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. And Heuss grabs the microphone, and he teaches them the verse that is now sung, that you'll hear at the World Cup this summer, Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, unity and right and freedom für das deutsche Vaterland. And that's the new official anthem. So Heuss, through the medium of football, is teaching Germans a new kind of nationalism. and football is the way that Germans have to learn to express their nationalism. The phrase associated in Germany with that match is "Wir sind wieder wer," we are somebody again. So football helps to create a new nation. Now, at that time, nobody had TVs in Europe, not many people, and gradually more and more people get TVs, and the World Cup becomes bigger. Every World Cup becomes the biggest media event in history, measured by number of viewers and now by number of clicks. Country where I grew up in Holland, we played against Uruguay in the last World Cup semi-finals. 12.3 million Dutch people watched the game on TV, which is 75% of the population. And for comparison, the Super Bowl, which of course is the biggest TV event in the US, is watched by about a third of the population. So these are the great national shared moments. Holland-Uruguay is the biggest shared post-war moment for Dutch people, just as the biggest post-war shared moment for French people after the liberation of 1944 is winning the World Cup in 1998, with the difference that in 1998 all French people were on the same side. So the national team comes to be the nation. It's the embodiment of the nation. Those 11 men in plastic shirts or in those cotton shirts, the Germans we saw earlier, they are Germany. This kind of, just as the water and the wine become the body of Jesus in Catholic liturgy, the football teams becomes the body of the nation, and they're more collective than, say, the Queen. They're more real than the flag, more tangible than gross domestic product. The team is the nation. Now, to be a nation, you need an enemy. It's no fun without an enemy. So you guys used to have the Russians, and then you got the Muslim terrorists, and now you're looking for somebody else. And in Europe, from the 50s through the 90s, we had an easy enemy. It was Germany. Everybody hated Germany, and this obviously had to do with the war. And so the unofficial national anthem of English football, Football's Coming Home, is all about matches England played against Germany. The most emotional French match in their history is the 1982 defeat to Germany in Seville, where the German keeper karate kicks a French player who has to be stretchered off, and this evokes for French people, sort of weirdly, it evokes for French people memories of the Nazi occupation. When Holland beat Germany in 1988, several million people go onto the streets to celebrate. So the World Cup is all about Germany. And it's not just the war. It's also because West Germany, has the economic miracle. It becomes the most important economic force in Europe. Obviously, it becomes somewhat important politically. And this is frustrating. It's irritating, right? We beat them in the war, and now they're very successful. And so a lot of anxieties about German economic might are expressed through the football team, because not only are they economically strong, they also win World Cups. From 1954 to 1990, they win 3. And so that provokes resentment and hatred. The German-British writer Philip Altermann, who I've played football with in the England writers team, we've played in writers' World Cups, which are not as good as real World Cups, but more fun. He writes, "I sometimes wonder if Germany in my lifetime has been hated with more passion than it ever was in the 1910s and 1940s. I mean, Holland-Germany matches provoke sometimes clashes along the shared border, and after England lost, of course, to Germany at Euro 96, in England, German cars were beaten up, Germans were beaten up, and Russians were beaten up because they looked like Germans. And Germany was very important to World Cups. It was the essential nation in World Cups, you could say. David Winner, the football writer, says, in terms of story, the greatest nation in the history of football is Germany. A World Cup without Germany would be like Star Wars without Darth Vader. Because Germany's the villain you need in the story. Germany's the bad guy that kills the beautiful teams, like Hungary in 54, Holland in 74, France in 82. Germany gives the whole thing a kind of moral fable. Now, I've been talking about the Europeans, but the other main actors are the Latin Americans in the period until 1990. And they have a different set of frustrations. They don't care about Germany. And I'll focus on Argentina because their World Cup history until the 90s is very closely intertwined with England. They care about us the way we care about Germany. And let's watch, if I can get it on the screen, Diego Maradona's famous handball goal against England in the World Cup quarter-final 1986.
6 minutes into the second half, major controversy. Maradona went on another run, beating Hoddle and playing a 1-2 with Valdano. But Hodge got there first. Maradona challenged Shilton and punched the ball into the net. The English players screamed for handball. Everyone had seen the infringement.
Not everyone had seen the infringement. It was actually very hard to see the infringement. And there was a kind of global debate. And a few days later, this German cameraman had the brilliant idea of playing the film backwards. And when you see it in rewind, you see Maradona's hand much more clearly. But the poor referee had no chance. So that's obviously cheating. Now, later that game, Maradona dribbles past half the England team to score the most beautiful goal in the history of the World Cup. But he says in his autobiography, I sometimes think I preferred the one with my hand. Why? It was a bit like stealing the wallet of the English. So what Maradona is expressing is Argentine nationalism as colonial frustration. I mean, they weren't really our colony, but well into the 20th century, Argentina was part of Britain's informal empire. So Brits ran the economy, Brits ran the railways, Brits shipped a lot of the meat out to Europe, and obviously this was incredibly irritating for Argentinians. So when they first beat England at football in 1953, an Argentine politician said, we nationalized the railways, and now we have nationalized football. And then they play this big game in 1966 at the World Cup in England, where the Argentine captain, Ratin, is sent off. He makes this gesture, which the referee interprets as an obscene gesture. And Ratin later said, I was pointing to the armband to show that I was the captain and had the right to engage him in debate. Ratin gets sent off, England win, and after the match, the England manager, Alf Ramsey, says that the Argentinians played like animals. And of course, this evokes 100 years of Argentine frustrations about British racism and superiority feelings. So England became the team the Argentines most wanted to beat. And Argentina in much of the 70s and 80s is ruled by military regimes, and military regimes like nationalism. And so when they hosted the World Cup in 1978 and Argentina won, the Argentina official World Cup song that year was Vamos Argentina, vamos a ganar. And then when they invaded the Falklands or the Malvinas Islands, British ruled 4 years later, they have this song on the radio, which is Vamos Argentina, vamos a ganar. The idea that soccer nationalism and invasion nationalism are the same kind of thing. World Cup is a festival of nationalism, war is, and that's how many nations thought about soccer in those days. So then we go on to '86, and Maradona's Argentina beat England, and Maradona says in his autobiography, it was if we had beaten a country, not just a football team. Although we had said before the game that football had nothing to do with the Malvinas War, we knew they had killed a lot of Argentine boys there, killed them like little birds, and this was revenge. So, okay, you've got this LATAM Euro festival of nationalism until about 1990, but then something really strange changes, that from about 1990, around the world, nationalism goes into decline, and I've made a beautiful PowerPoint which gives some of the trends that you're starting to see just around that time. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, China's opening up, the communist bloc, the Soviet bloc opens. You get more and more democracies, so in Africa that process is named perestroika, after perestroika in Russia and done by Paris in Africa. And you get a growth of world trade. It expands very rapidly, partly because of those developments. Then you get the internet coming along, and you get more and more cable TV, which of course had started in the US earlier, but in most of the world was rather new. So you get a much quicker spread of information. And partly as a result of all these factors, you get a decline in wars as well, which also makes it easier for countries to communicate. So you get this decline of nationalism outside soccer. And globalization, if you like, becomes the underlying ideology of the global economy. And these new technologies create this interconnected world. So I live in Paris now. The Eurostar tunnel opened, I think, in 1994. And so you can now go from Paris to London by train 2 hours, 15 minutes. Probably quicker than going from here to UCLA, you know. So it's, these countries, these cities are almost now twin cities. They're totally connected. International financial markets as well. And you get a new global language. You get English, which becomes a very efficient way of communicating in most of the world. It's the Latin of the 21st century. And so in this new world, national governments become a little bit irrelevant, especially in Europe. I mean, where countries give up their currencies, which was a big national tool. So you now have 12 European countries using the euro. They don't fight wars anymore, so the military is not so important. And national borders, particularly in our part of the world, have become invisible. So now if you go from France to Belgium, or from Spain to France, Germany to Holland, there's no border. You don't even know when you've crossed the border. And so these changes make national governments and nationalism sort of redundant. National armies, you know, there's not much you can do with them. You guys have the biggest army in the world, but what are you going to do with it? We've just seen Russia invade the Crimea. And if it's a war, then by some estimates, it's the first interstate war in the world since 2008. And in the first month of this war or conflict, 3 people died. So it's a very different kind of world scene than we used to have. And Russians say in polls they don't want to fight, although they like to have the Crimea. Ukrainians pulled out of Crimea without fighting for it. And even in the US, even a hawk like John McCain, knows, has admitted that you can't really fight the war for the Crimea. And last year, 52% of Americans polled by the Pew Research Center agreed with the statement that, quote, the US should mind its own business internationally. And that's the highest proportion that agreed with that statement since that question was first asked 50 years ago. It's higher even than when the last helicopter was leaving Saigon and Americans were fed up with the Vietnam War. So when national wars become very rare, there's less reason to be nationalistic, because if nobody's attacking your nation, you don't have to think about the nation as much. It's not protecting you. Less important. Now, this winding down of nationalism you start to see in World Cups also from the 90s. They become less nationalist, more cosmopolitan. And I've, as I say, witnessed some of this at first hand. And I noticed this disappearance of old-style nationalism most strongly in 2006, when the World Cup was held in Germany. And what you saw then was a shift to a kind of party nationalism, where fans all show up, and they dress in their national colors, but it's a kind of carnival. We're all having fun together. So you're wearing a Brazil shirt, and you're wearing a Germany shirt, and I'm wearing a Norway shirt, and then we all go to a bar and we drink beer together. So it's not a kind of who's proving which nation is superior. It's all having fun together in a kind of global cosmopolitan party. And Oliver Bierhoff, the German team's general manager, he said in 2006, it's very surprising. The fans just aren't so interested in results anymore. I mean, Germany came third in a World Cup at home, and fans were deliriously happy. It was more about party, having fun with people from different countries. And yeah, people still support their national teams, but that support is less serious, less of a life and death matter than it once was. I'm going to show you some scenes from Bilbao in northern Spain. And Bilbao is part of the Basque Country, as you'll know. And many people in the Basque Country want a separate state. There's actually been terrorism for Basque independence in past decades. And to go around with a Spain shirt in the past would have been unwise, unhealthy in Bilbao. But when Spain won the World Cup in 2010, people came to the central fountain in the commercial district of Bilbao. This is very badly filmed by somebody who's celebrating himself. But it gives you a sense. These are people in the middle of Bilbao, waving Spain flags, wearing Spain shirts, drunk, having a really good time. I mean, what you'd see anywhere in the world when a team wins the World Cup or wins a big game. And of course, this is banal drunk people shouting in front of the camera. But in the past in Bilbao, that kind of behavior could have got you seriously hurt. And these people are not saying, I've decided I love Spain, I don't like being a Basque anymore. They're not making a political statement. They're just having a party. They're out there having fun. You saw similar scenes in Barcelona, the capital of Catalonia, when Spain won. Catalans went out and they celebrated Spain's victory. Not because it had changed their political allegiance, but it's a great party, right? Your team wins the World Cup, what could be more fun? So it's a holiday nationalism where you paint your face with the national flag, but you wouldn't dream of dying for your country. And one reason people have managed to lighten up a bit about these things, about World Cups, is because the memory of World War II, which was the bitter European memory, the thing that was in people's minds all the time when dealing with other Europeans, has faded. For your generation in the US and in Europe, even for my generation, World War II is becoming like the American Civil War. It's remembered by history buffs. It's not really a big deal for the general public. It's become part of history rather than something that informs our thinking in the present. And that's why that World Cup of 2006 felt like a pan-European party to mark the emotional end of World War II, which is why it had to end in Berlin, which was where the war had all begun. It was a tournament, the tournament was a European-wide love fest for Germany. And a few days before the final, there was a conference at the Haus der Wannsee-Konferenz in Berlin. And the Haus der Wannsee-Konferenz is infamous because it's where senior German officials met in 1942 to plan the mechanized Holocaust, to plan the concentration camps. So we had this conference there to reflect on soccer and German history. And I went for a walk with the guy from the German Soccer Association, whose job it was to field media queries and queries from the public about German soccer in World War II. So if you were a journalist and you wanted to ask about Nazism, you ended up on the phone with him. And this, of course, is the biggest media event in history. So I said to him, have you had many calls from journalists wanting to talk to you about Germany, soccer, and World War II? And he said the number is 0. No journalist has shown any interest in this issue since the World Cup began, or at least not to call him. And this is really something rather new, that Germany, in 2006, that summer, I think that was the moment that they managed collectively to shed World War II as the factor that identified them before the eyes of the world. Now, at some matches, you do still see World War II imagery. So when England played Germany, the England fans do this imitation of Spitfires bombing Germany, which is incredibly stupid, but English people love. And Dutch fans in 2006 in Germany, they wore these German helmets painted orange in the Dutch colors. Again, incredibly bad taste, incredibly stupid. But it's not really saying we hate Germany or this is a real enactment of World War II. It's fun. So World War II is used, the imagery is used to make the soccer more fun, to spice it up a bit in a tasteless but light-hearted way. The animating force of hate is no longer present, I would argue, which is why at these England-Germany games, Holland-Germany games, the fans now stand mixed. You buy a ticket illegally on the black market, you end up in the German section, nobody cares. Now, I've pointed to some of the factors outside soccer that have limited nationalism. You've got this rise of trade and internet, the end of wars, globalization. But there's also a factor inside soccer that reduces nationalism, and that's the end of national playing styles. Because before about 1990, all the talk was about the national styles. And to some degree, it was parodic and it was ridiculous. So the idea that Brazil plays to the rhythm of samba and the Germans play like a great big tank or machine and the English fight like warriors. But certainly it was true that each country had a distinct style. And when Holland played England, you could see which was which. Now all that is starting to fade because from the mid-90s, it became very easy for soccer players to move between countries. TV showed them how other people played. So now when England play Italy, they play the same soccer very largely. It's very hard to tell them apart. There's an international style which you kind of have to play. I interviewed Michael Owen once, who was the first English player really to rise after the age of Europeanization, when all the styles became the same. He made his debut for England, I think, in 1998. And he said he wasn't an English player. He had been raised as a European player. So it's no longer possible in World Cups to say, I prefer Brazil because our football is superior in its style. I mean, that's one of the frustrations of Brazilians, that the football they play in World Cups is not distinctively Brazilian typically anymore. And it's true for all countries. And then you've got the players. They've also become globalized because Karl Marx says the ruling ideology of every age is the ideology of the ruling class. And the ideology of the 1%, the global elite now, is globalization. And soccer players belong to this global elite. Someone like Cristiano Ronaldo is much more at home in a first-class airport lounge than he would be in a bar on the back streets of Lisbon. And his life is much more like Wayne Rooney's life or Mesut Ozil's life or even Landon Donovan's life than their lives are like the people back home in their own countries. So these guys become part of the globalized elite, and they sort of shed some of their national distinctiveness. They get traded internationally in this totally open economic sector. So in short, soccer is part of that increase in global trade that I was talking about earlier. It's become an international sector. So increasingly when we watch the World Cup, we're watching not fellow countrymen of ours, but we're watching cosmopolitans. I was in Nuremberg in 2006, again a name redolent with European nationalist past, watching Holland-Portugal. And it was a very vicious game. People kept getting sent off. And two players had been sent off, the Dutchman van Bronckhorst and the Portuguese Deco, went and sat on a bench next to each other, and during this very vicious, important match, began to chat. Because they weren't really Dutch and Portuguese. They were teammates at Barcelona, and they were probably talking Spanish. And they were fellow cosmopolitans. In the next round, Portugal-England, Cristiano Ronaldo conspires to help get England's Wayne Rooney sent off. But after the match, Rooney on the bus sends Cristiano a text message saying, it's okay, good luck in the next round. Because they play together at Manchester United, and Rooney knows professionally it's important that they maintain good relations. So it's hard as a fan watching the World Cup, to get all fired up and nationalist and hate the other team, when the players obviously don't hate the other team anymore. I mean, I was at the last Holland-Germany in Donetsk, I think, in eastern Ukraine in 2012. And, you know, Germany were much better and we lost. And afterwards, the players all hug and they all know each other anyway. So all these nationalist enmities no longer matter to the protagonists. And even fans, sorry, that sounds pretty disastrous. Even fans, let me restore this. Even fans are starting to choose, does that work? Which national team to support. So again, at that World Cup in 2006, I went to Brazil, Croatia. And before the game, there's tens of thousands of people walking around the Berlin Stadium in the famous yellow canary Brazil shirts. And I thought, right, well, the Brazilians have come out in large numbers. But then as you walk past people, you realize they're not Brazilians. They're Swedes, they're English, they're Germans. They've come from all over the world, bought a Brazil shirt to identify with the kind of idea of jogo bonito, Brazilian football. And they're there as kind of like you know, pop fans. They're paying tribute. They're not being nationalist. Another game, I was on the metro, and there were these four guys wearing Argentina shirts. And then suddenly they begin speaking German to each other. So all these, there is a shift, it's very hard to quantify, in people who go to a World Cup not to support their national team. And my sense is it's a growing phenomenon driven partly by club soccer. Because let's say now you're an Englishman and you support Chelsea. You probably have a warmer feeling about Eden Hazard, who plays for Belgium and Chelsea, or Samuel Eto'o, who plays for Cameroon and Chelsea, than you do about Wayne Rooney, who plays against Chelsea. So these national feelings become less important. Okay, I now want to talk in the last bit a little bit more about your country and about Brazil. And you see that as people become less nationalist, they start to worry less about national glory. National glory is less important on the field, but also less important off the field. It just doesn't inspire people as much anymore in their politics. And I'm going to show you what Lula, the then Brazilian president, said in 2007, with tears in his eyes, when Brazil were awarded the World Cup, for which admittedly they were the only bidder at the time. And Lula says, after Brazil's named host, "Today I felt prouder of being a Brazilian than on any other day. Today's the day Brazil gained its international citizenship, the day we've overcome the last vestiges of prejudice against us, day to celebrate Brazil's left behind second-class countries, entered the ranks of first-class countries. Today we earned respect. This is Brazil's time." So that's a classic statement of national glory from the age of nationalism. But fast forward 7 years, and as David told you the other week, you don't hear that kind of thing so much in Brazil anymore. And this is what Romário, the great Brazilian soccer player turned Brazilian parliamentarian, is saying now in 2014. Not so much national glory. So Romário says, imagine if that money for the World Cup had been used for education. The schools could have served lunches, air conditioning, paid teachers fair wages. The 2014 World Cup is the biggest robbery in Brazilian history. Now, a lot of people agree with Romário about that, hence the protests during the Confederations Cup in Brazil last year. And people say, you know, why are we spending all this money on stadiums instead of on schools and hospitals? And so you've seen the shift, not total, but the weighting is different now. That whereas in 2007 there was more talk of national glory, now there is more talk of what your president calls nation building at home. That's really what Romário is talking about, nation building at home. And the same shift is happening in the US in your debate. 10 years ago, you had a president making nationalist statements about foreign wars, wrapping himself in the flag, and now you have a president who's much more interested in nation building at home. I want to end by talking about soccer in your country, because it seems to me that the rise in soccer fandom in the US, of which this talk is a tiny symptom, is part of what I'm talking about, that America's turning into a soccer country these last 20 years exemplifies exactly the globalization, the fading of national borders that my talk has been about. Now I'm going to show you a very short clip from a Simpsons episode in 1997, when the Continental Soccer Association, which is really the World Cup in disguise, by an amazing coincidence comes to Springfield. I hope you can hear what Homer says. I don't know how good the sound is.
This match will determine once and for all which nation is the greatest on earth, Mexico or Portugal.
I'll show you a very brief clip. This is The Simpsons in 1997. I'll show you a very brief clip from the game itself. This is taken from the Czech version of The Simpsons. Great excitement in Springfield as the match kicks off. However, and the fans get fed up with this, and later they get so angry that there's a pitch invasion. So as Nigel was saying earlier, this episode of The Simpsons has all the American cliches about soccer from that era in a very short burst. Now, times have changed, because on March 30th there was a special Simpsons World Cup episode with Homer as a World Cup referee. And what we've seen really, if you're an undergraduate during your lifetime, is the invasion of the World Cup by soccer. Just before the last World Cup, I was in New York, and I noticed going around New York that there was more World Cup, this was just before kickoff, than there was in Paris, where I live. So the sides of buses, big ads, watch World Cup on our channel. In bars, watch the World Cup here. People were going around in national team shirts. And in Paris, none of that. And then just before the US team flew to South Africa, 2010, they were received at the White House by President Obama, who of course is the father of soccer players, and by Bill Clinton. And as you know, normally when two presidents get together, there's been a humanitarian disaster. But soccer has become a big deal even in US politics. And the biggest US game at the last World Cup against Ghana, it wasn't even such a big deal. And if you were living in California, it was on TV about noon on a Saturday. Nonetheless, that game drew an average US TV audience of about 17 million viewers. And that was higher than the average TV audience for a baseball World Series game that year, 2010, or for the average NBA Finals game in 2010. And this year in Brazil, by far the largest group of visiting fans will be from the US, which was also true in South Africa. So what's going on here? And I'd say that what we're seeing is cultural globalization of American daily life by the rest of the world. Because the cliche in my part of the world is always about Americanization. You guys, you send over your Levi's jeans and your Hollywood films and your rappers, and you Americanize our beautiful cultures. But what I'm arguing now is that we're seeing a reverse movement with soccer, which is globalizing you. And today it's the two most globalized groups of Americans who follow soccer most keenly. You got I think approximately 50 million Hispanics, most of them from Mexico, who tend to be interested in soccer. And then you got you guys, the upper middle classes, who also played soccer from the age of 6 and are now having to sit through a talk on soccer by some European. And you get this growing American tribe of soccer nerds who, they hate the word soccer, it has to be football, and they tell you the club they support, and they supported it even before it became good, and they give you a long analysis of the tactics of that club's manager, during which I zone out, because they want to prove that they're globalized people who know soccer. And there's a counter-argument, which is, oh, well, soccer hasn't taken off yet in America because nobody watches the MLS, or it won't until. But that's to misunderstand the nature of American soccer culture. American soccer culture is a million things. It's the college team, it's girls soccer, it's five-a-side, it's watching Mexican or Salvadorian or English soccer on TV, it's going around in a Real Madrid shirt. It's a mosaic of all those things. And the MLS is just part of that mosaic. And increasingly, anyway, Americans do watch the MLS. Their average attendance last year, 18,594, higher than for the average NBA or NHL game, although admittedly soccer teams play fewer games. So soccer is a marker of the globalization of American life, and it makes American soccer fans feel cosmopolitan, which is why it's high status here to, what can be high status to say that you're a soccer person. And they probably are more cosmopolitan because they've embraced a foreign game. And I would argue that if you did some kind of sociological study of the average American soccer fan, you would find that he or she was probably a more cosmopolitan person than, say, the average NFL fan here. So these American soccer fans are part of the worldwide retreat from nationalism. And I'll end, I promise this is the end, by asking one very large question. What do people around the world feel now? If they feel less nationalist, I mean, of course, they're still a bit nationalist, and our identities are multiple, as Amartya Sen says, so you feel lots of things, and one thing is about your nation. But if they're less nationalist now, what are they? And recently I've become addicted to Twitter. And in Twitter you get very few characters to define yourself in your bio. And it's very interesting to see what people write. often they'll say something like, I'm Ahmed, I'm from Bangladesh, I'm 100% Manchester United. I'm Chuck from Tennessee, New York Yankees and Arsenal. And so these people are using the international medium of Twitter to give themselves an international identity through a particular soccer team. And when you spend time on Twitter, you start to feel that the old nation versus nation setup of World Cups is getting a bit outdated. We've seen that nationalism has had a good run. It got 200 years as a kind of the #1 ideology, and now it may be on its way out. Thanks very much for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions.